without further ado, excited to dive in with some introductions. To start, really excited to introduce Annie Greenberg. Annie is the Executive Creative Director for Lonely Planet. Annie is a Webby Award-winning creative director, strategist, and executive producer with 12 plus years of experience developing brand, voice, look, and feel, and premium video for documentary to commercial for multi-platform distribution. Before Lonely Planet, she was at Refinery 29 and Echo. Annie has been featured in 17, Cosmopolitan, and NY Mag, and has appeared on Entertainment Tonight, Access Hollywood, and The Wendy Williams Show. Annie, a warm welcome and thank you for being here today. Everybody would love to hear, what is a brand that inspires you or a creative campaign that inspires you?
What comes to mind is that the Super Bowl commercial that Expedia did with Ewan McGregor, where he's like walking through that warehouse and he's like, we all have stuff. And he's like talking about stuff, but then at the end, it's about not buying stuff and having experiences. And that moved me. So yeah, shout out to that campaign. And thanks for having me.
I have to ask Annie also, why were you on the Wendy Williams Show?
Well, Shane, in a past life, I was a fashion editor and we were doing like silly little fashion segments, and it was honestly a thrill every time I would go on and like tell you what was popular for spring.
Amazing. Cool. Well, let's move to our next panelist here is Rafat Ali. Rafat is the founder and CEO of Skift, the largest industry intelligence and marketing platform in the travel industry. Previously, he was the founder and CEO of Paid Content and Content Next, which he sold to the UK's Guardian News in Media in 2008 and left in 2010. Before Guardian, he was managing editor of Silicon Alley Report. Rafat was the Knight Fellow at Indiana University, where he completed his master's in journalism. Prior to that, he completed his BSc in computer engineering from AMU in India. Welcome, Rafat.
Hey, Shane, thank you for having me.
Rafat, any favorite brand or creative campaign that you've seen in food and travel?
So since we live and breathe this 24/7 at Skift, so I am attracted to smaller destinations. So I would say the creative work that Iceland does or Puerto Rico does, and then Fiji just came out with a new campaign. Just so happens all three are islands, I suppose. That was not the intent, but that's the connecting thread. The smaller you are, the more you have to hustle to break through. And so I really like the creative outputs of all three of those destinations.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rafat. Last but definitely not least, super honored to have Nick Bilardello here with us today. Nick is the Chief Brand Officer at the Infatuation and Zagat. The Infatuation started in 2009 by, quote, two guys working in the music business who couldn't find reliable, honest restaurant recommendations in New York City. It blossomed truly into a global media brand. Prior to the Infatuation, Nick worked in art and creative direction at Warner Music, Sony Music, and HarperCollins. Please, everybody, let's welcome Nick.
Thank you very much for having me.
Nick, favorite brand or campaign you've seen in food and travel? What do we got?
As the resident food guy, I have to, I guess, definitely think of something in the food category. But honestly, it's really more just like the overarching brand of Shake Shack, I think is just fantastic. Like burgers and fries aside, what they do visually and from a brand perspective at a global scale is like really impressive. And then to continuously be doing partnerships without third-party brands and still feel really true to what they do through all of it, I think is like really impressive.
Love that. Cool. Well, so we're gonna dive in here into just a quick overview of AIR, just to talk everybody through a little bit of who I am and what we're doing here. Something that brought everybody together. I promise I'll be quick, and then we'll just dive into the discussion itself. We started AIR just about 5 years ago now. And in short, we think about AIR as a creative operation system. We're trying to put creativity at the center of an organization and automate all the different touch points that creative has around the org. We believe at AIR that every single company around the globe is a media company, regardless of whether they work in sports, hospitality, travel, or food. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do is solve the needs of creatives. We think that so much of the time spent on Nick's team or Annie's team or Rafat's team is on the logistics of coordinating content back and forth with different partners. And so there, we're trying to build a software product to help creative teams manage creative work. To not belabor the point, today we work with 120,000 users. It's about 1,500 brands that use our product. We manage over 50 million images and videos for these brands. If you'd like to check us out, feel free to hold your phone up to the screen. This will just direct you to our website, which is air.inc. Cool. All right. Well, let's dive in and get started in today's discussion. There'll be 4 parts for today's discussion. We'll start by talking about building a brand in this category of food and travel. We'll then dive super deep into social. Obviously, it's super critical to those efforts. We'll talk broadly about content and how content and brand meet together. And then, the last part, we'll dive into what it's like being a creative director and the role of creative direction in this respective field. So again, we'll talk through building a brand, social, content, and creative direction. Cool. To start with building the brand, I would love to start with the iconic brands of Lonely Planet and the Infatuation. So Nick and Annie, whether it's books with things like Zagat, printed publications, as I know they have at Lonely Planet. What I've found has been super interesting is how bringing your audience with you is really important across all the different places where your brand lives. Out of curiosity, like for Nick and Annie, has any of that shifted? For your creative and marketing, has that shifted in a massive way post-pandemic? And is that being accelerated by Gen Z in any interesting ways for either of you? Maybe Nick, we can start.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, one of the terms that was very popular coming on the other side of the pandemic, or even during it, I think we knew all was coming, was the expression of revenge travel. Like people felt like they were locked away for a while and really wanted to get out and lean into more experience. And you've seen it across, I think, everything, both experiential to restaurants to hotels to everything, is like the idea of giving people opportunities to create social moments, to create conversation around what they're doing and why. So I think more than ever, we want to lean into the idea that like Gen Z really wants to show what they're doing and like really create a brand experience that is shareable. And what that means has evolved a lot over time and was frivolous and trivial at first for a while, but now is really more about storytelling. So I think more than ever, you're seeing brands want to create experiences for people with an intent to share, but not in just a visual sensory sense. Is like really giving people opportunities to tell really great stories. So for the Infatuation, I think directly is like, we know that the conversation is happening about where to go and what to do. And post-pandemic, I think more than ever, people are looking for that information of where should I go? Where should I spend my time? What should I invest my time in? And we're lucky enough to be a brand that is focused on trying to help people do that.
What about at Lonely Planet? Anything similarly that's changed post-pandemic?
Yeah, totally. I think like post-pandemic, people really, if we used to like live to work, now we kind of work to live, and there's more of this like abundant travel mindset. So people are going places for longer, working from there, working remotely. And so I think it's kind of travel is more a part of the conversation than it ever was. And for us, it's about giving folks a place to find inspiration, places they hadn't thought of going before, and then obviously the tools to navigate it. And I think that's, ever more increasingly showing up where our users are, as you mentioned, like on our phones, on social media, and making sure that it feels accessible to them when they're in the destination. But I think in terms of like the post-pandemic move, it's really just about making travel even more accessible across the entire user journey, from inspiration and discovery to that actual tactical, practical, I'm here now, what do I do? And to us, it's like increasingly moving to digital and across the social sphere.
Yeah. I mean, Rafat, curious, I mean, you have a global base of partners that you work with here. Like, what are the trends you're seeing with how this younger cohort is either booking or planning or executing on their travel?
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating, and it can't be travel and food isn't divorced from the larger changes that are happening on millennials and Gen Z. If you thought millennials were different, just concentrate them tenfold, and that makes it Gen Z. And they've had the most amount of break from the previous generation. I think Gen Z is probably in terms of habits of what they do, the fully digital, completely digitally native generation. I am of Gen X, I guess, and I'm the last generation on earth that grew up analog and are now in the digital age after us completely digital. So very different habits. At some point, social networks, which is how networks they used to be called, became social media. And that one word change is a very important change, because it then became about expression versus connection. Certainly was true for the millennial generation. What's happening is Gen Z, again, not to too broad a brush, but are trying to reclaim the networking part back, which is the communication and connection with each other, because they're a little bit overexposed and tired of performing all the time on social media. This is generally trends that are happening. People are moving to more one-to-one communication tools versus Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. So certainly that's showing up in travel, where the brands have to figure out how to be beyond just on social media, which was obviously 101 that we learned 10 years ago, 15 years ago, to now how to figure out how to connect people with each other. And so whether it's brands like, there's a brand called Hostel World, which is a hostel booking site where you can book, where they've created these chat communities for people who are staying at a similar hostel for the same dates, so that they can connect with each other. It's just a great example. And they're actually finding a lot of success, particularly in the Latin America market, just because they want to connect. It's just culturally more prone to connecting with each other. So fascinating example of how a different break from what previous generation of travel used to be versus a little bit of back to networking, the human-to-human connection.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, Nick and Annie, is there anything surrounding networking that is influencing how you guys are going about and changing your media strategy? I mean, one of the reasons I ask is because I feel like for travel specifically, influencers are just so important in your space, and mass sort of media communication on social is so important. And there must be this tension between the brand and the brand voice that you want to have versus the personal brand of these influencers that you might be working with. So curious on how the influencer piece meets Rafat's point about networking versus social media, and maybe how your strategies are evolving.
Yeah, so I think for us, we tend to work with people that I don't know if traditional media would consider influencers, but we think they're influential in that they have a point of view on a place and something to say. And one of the things that I've been really bullish on at Lonely Planet is moving from places of interest to people of interest, and creating and uplifting local voices as a way of spreading lots of intel about a place. So if we're going to do an itinerary story, a lot of times we'll look at it from the local perspective and the travel perspective, and we put people at the heart of that story. I think like word of mouth is the most potent connectivity for recommendation. And it's not just about, go to this restaurant, but who told me to go? That is more meaningful and emotional to me than the restaurant that I've never been to and just the name on a map. So we definitely see that as a shift, but I think for us, it's less about influencers and follower count and more about, the expert and the local expert. We work with and have acquired a company called Elsewhere that is travel planning through local recommendations from top to tail. So again, the focus I think is on people that have, meaningful stories to tell and itineraries to share, not necessarily like influencers in the traditional sense, though we also do that as well.
Yeah, Nick, super curious in your thought, even specifically because, post JP Morgan acquisition now, I'm sure you guys are thinking about scaling out to a ton of cities across the US. And, as a customer of the brand, I feel like what the Infatuation has done so well has been so local and so authentic to even the neighborhoods within New York City, as an example. So curious how you think about that and how that meets scale.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many components to this, and specifically with influencers, right? And like the shift towards the democratization of reach and how many people can talk about as much topics and information as they want comparatively, like when an editorial brand has been doing it for a really long time, right? So like it's a kind of a couple components. I think when we're talking about brand building, a really important thing is that social is only one component of building a brand, right? Building a brand is 360. And that's why, going back to the networking point that Rafat made, is like experiential and bringing people together is something that brands can do at a level that influencers never can, right? Like ultimately the connectivity of influencers is almost like, from a blockchain perspective, like their power in numbers. But a brand, and our opportunity specifically for us to throw an event, a large scale event in multi markets at once, is something that is like, we're bringing people together in a moment to have shared experiences, which is what people are yearning and looking for. And I think that's sort of that other level of brand building that influencers might be able to give you information or perspective. You know, for years, for a really long time, brands couldn't create personality. They had to like really work to figure out how to do that. And now the inverse is happening, where influencers have the personality and people are gravitating towards that. But I think brands have an opportunity to get back into the tune to the fact that they're at a larger scale than that, they can affect masses in a lot of different ways, right? So when we think about influencers, it's like, yes, we want people to be part of our ethos. We want the more information and the more connectivity to what we're doing as a brand in terms of like giving information around cities is a one-to-one relationship that influencers are doing as well. But when you just said it, on a local level, when we're in a market, we want people to be feeling all of those touch points, to really feel like the Infatuation is representation of information that I can access and experience I can access at a different level in a multitude of ways beyond just a piece of content on social. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think Nick's point about brand also is a good segue maybe to a broader point. You know, I feel like we talk to so many creative directors at AIR, and I feel like a thread that almost is weaved into the discussion on an ongoing basis, regardless of industry, is that in some ways your brand is not your own anymore, and the community is really owning the definition of that brand. Do the three of you really subscribe to that ideology, or would you tweak that definition at all? And then, you know, how are you, if you do believe in it, how are you leveraging that creative to either facilitate the community defining that brand, or do you push back against it? You know, just curious in how each of you think about that. Maybe Rafat?
Yeah, I'm thinking. It's a tough one, because community, well, define a community. A Twitter community, I would never, ever, ever want my brand to be in control of a freaking Twitter community. Can we use that word? I don't know if we can. Social, if the community is social media, certainly they can define aspects of it. Like, for instance, let's just take an example, very recent example. ChatGPT. It's not, it's a brand, right? It's become a brand just in the last few weeks. The way people are using and coming up with new uses of it. So the community is in charge in many ways of defining what types of usage is coming out of ChatGPT, which is very interesting. Like how are different ways in which we're coming up with new ways of using this tool in our lives, and they're sharing it in all different types of social platforms. So fascinating example of a thing that caught on so quickly, and people are defining how big it's becoming so fast, versus a more established brand where certainly there's a lot of Disney, for example, very much in control of their brand, very much in control of what people and influencers can do with their brand, and they'll sue the hell out of them if they do something out of the guidelines. So different approaches.
What about, Annie, what about at Lonely Planet? I think the brand has been around, it's a little bit definitely deeper of a brand than, or has a deeper history, I should say, than like a ChatGPT. It's gone through obviously different waves and levels of growth. Curious on how you would think about that, as far as community defining your brand versus your intentional moves against it.
Yeah, I think I think we welcome our community continuing to define and redefine our brands. We're coming up on our 50th anniversary. If we didn't welcome that feedback and help our audience if we didn't bring them into the conversation, I think we would be doing something wrong, right? So that has everything to do with, again, uplifting local voices and really thinking through who our contributors are, what our contributor network looks like, finding them potentially in our audience through fans, through people who read our content, but then also listening when they talk on platforms like Instagram. And, if we ask a question like, how can we help you? That's at the heart of what we do every day. How can we help you travel better? How can we help you travel more meaningfully? How can we help you walk away with more memorable experiences? And if we ask those questions, we better be willing to listen. And then that helps us kind of carve and create our content. So I would say that we're in dialogue with them. I mean, it's no secret that we've had Thorntree and all of historically these very feverish communities of travelers that look to Lonely Planet as kind of a lightning rod for conversation. And I think that it's something that we welcome as we continue to define and redefine our brand over the decades. It started from, one guy, Tony Wheeler and Maureen Wheeler, a couple, and then now it's a much bigger, more evolved thing. And I think community, again, is really at the heart of that. We have daily franchises where we listen to our audience and take it into consideration as we're molding the content.
I mean, Nick, you've got one of the sort of most difficult challenges here, in that you've got a legacy brand in Zagat that in many ways is community driven and community contributed, to form these statements about restaurants. Then you've got an editorial voice in the Infatuation that's newer and still defining itself. How do you think about either the tension between those two things, or is it the same strategy for both?
Honestly, community building is brand building now, right? Like I just gave a whole presentation around how converting consumers to feeling like they are part of a community is actually just brand building in 2023 now. And I think one of the great things that we had an advantage of was coming from the music business, was we took a lot of cues from we could point to a lot of the perspectives we were doing in the music space, which was making people feel like our audience really was more fans than they were consumers. And when you could point to a lot of the things we were doing in the music business and in leveraging experiential and feeling like people were coming to concerts with merchandise, and we were attacking brand building the only way we knew how, which was to actually make people feel like they were part of something. And because we didn't understand how to scale at that point, right? So all we were doing was figuring out how to make people feel like they had, we were using the term social equity, like the value of being part of our world. And then they were our marketers, right? Because anyone can point to the idea of you discover a really great artist and you want to tell everybody about it. Like I was on it first, or I heard it first. And that word of mouth around community building and brand building is so crucial from a grassroots perspective. But now, and where we're at now, scale really is community building, because these are the platforms that we have to use is user generated. So to your point and your reference about Zagat as a legacy brand versus the Infatuation, they kind of ended up in the same place, just from two completely different eras, right? Like Zagat was doing it really was the first brand to do user generated content. It was like paper surveys. And the way they incentivized people to fill out paper surveys was getting a book, right? You got an item and then you were part of that knowledge base. Like you knew the information and you felt connected to it. And obviously just like good branding 101, one color, one simple shape, the book fit in your pocket. It was all really intuitive ways of thinking about it. But now we kind of do the same things with the Infatuation, just in a much different sense, in that we want people to feel like they're part of the conversation. When we're putting out an editorial piece of point of view, we embrace the feedback and the disagreements. And, a lot of the stuff we work on is how to make people feel like they're part of something. And Zagat has been doing that for over 40 years, so yeah. It's all the same thing. It's just the platforms and the mediums you use now versus back then.
Yeah. Love that. Switching to our next topic, I want to take a bit of a step out of the weeds of travel and food and just talk about, the media industry and then creative direction in your jobs at large. Maybe to start, I think it's super interesting to see how, Skift went from a blog and then became, a media company. I watched I was doing some prep for this, and I watched an early interview you did in 2011, and I wrote down a quote for you where you said, "We would like to become the lingo of the tech industry. Media is of the travel industry. Sorry, media is not rocket science. It's simple. Cover a sector to the best you can. Either you can sell the audience, or you sell to the audience." Just out of curiosity, like what inspired you, Rafat? And then, obviously Annie and Nick would love to bring you in as well. But Rafat, what inspired you to build a media company? Would you ever do it again? Would you do it again today? Why or why not? Just curious.
I lost my hair in my first company. My beard became white in my second. I don't know what I have left to lose in my third one. But media, we don't do this for the money. We do for the love of it. That's all of you know this very well. It's for us, when we launched it, the big pitch was we want to be the Bloomberg of travel. That was one of the early pitches, news research conferences for the global travel industry. The travel industry, for being one of the world's largest industries, was still viewed as sort of a leisure industry, which meant that it was a disposable industry. And so we wanted it to have the rigor and analysis that came in, for instance, the tech industry, the finance industry, from the media perspective, to the travel industry. And we certainly brought that. We're now 11 years in as a company. And so a lot of it was what we are talking about, brand, and brand building is sort of brick by brick, story by story for us. Like we have owned franchises. Like, what is Airbnb's effect on the world? We've owned that story from day one. Sort of our rise and Airbnb's rise, just on hugely different scales, are parallel in the sense that we started when Airbnb was just taking off. So we could own that story. We could own mobile becoming the center of our life and experience, particularly in travel. So we've owned some of these big franchises, and now with AI coming into the world and travel, certainly that's a big push for us, is to own these franchises. So your brand then becomes about what is the unique take that you have on the world that people gravitate towards. For us, it's very much about where the future of travel is going. Simple. And there's so many layers beneath it. We're very particular about the colors we use, the experience we want at our conferences. We just had a conference in London last week. The feeling that people came away with is our brand. And it's the same, I'm sure, for Infatuation with your events and everything else as well. So it's the feeling that people come away with is what the brand then is. And that helps us become better at refining that experience and keeping that connection. So I think that's, there are a lot of layers to it, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah. But Annie, you worked in media for over a decade at Refinery 29. Why have you decided to stay in media, in this field of creative direction? Why not go to another industry or sector? Why the transition into travel? Maybe just curious in your thoughts there.
Yeah. Oh, I just love making things. I love being on set. I love writing. This was just kind of like, I didn't know this job existed when I graduated school, because it didn't, but I'm really happy that it does. I kind of slid into travel by way of video development and content development and video direction. I was doing a bunch of like docs, and then did this travel show called 60 Second Cities, and then sold that to Echo. And it was the first choose your own adventure travel show. Shout out 60 Second Cities, The World Your Way, that we made right before the pandemic. And then when Lonely Planet came up, it was acquired by Red Ventures, and I was consulting for them. And when the opportunity to come on board full-time as the creative director came up, I was like, well, if I don't do this now, at this moment where we're kind of redefining the digital space for Lonely Planet, like, I will regret it forever. And so that's why I decided to do that then. But yeah, I arrived in travel and creative direction by way of just like doing a bunch of stuff and finding a way to get passionate about everything. I think the fun thing about like being a creative director and also doing like documentary films is you have to, it's my fire alarm about to go off. You have to kind of like be an expert in everything when the time is right, so that you can drop in and, understand how to communicate with folks in a totally different world than you. And anyway, that's part of what I love about my job, and certainly what I love about travel as well.
Yeah. What about you, Nick? Would you ever start a media company?
Annie just said it all perfectly. Like, that's, it's all just making stuff is awesome, right? I didn't mean to cut you off, but like, she personified it perfectly. It's like there's, I think as creatives or brand builders or media people generally, it's like, give me a topic and I just want to figure out like how to convey that to people in like the most interesting ways possible. Right. Like, one of the best things about working with Chris and Andrew and like doing the Infatuation was the touch points are all different. And, Annie again had said like being an expert in a lot of different things, because you can do so much. One of the first things, walking through the door, and we had done a lot of experiential, we had done a lot of events, and Chris, our CEO, kind of like once I really came on proper full time and spent all my time and energy into like, how are we going to scale the Infatuation? He was like, we're going to just throw this really big food festival in Los Angeles. And I was like, okay, yeah, I get it. And then took me to the space and he was like, yeah, there's gonna be like 10,000 people here. And I was like, okay, do we have any idea how to actually do that? And we didn't, we really, really didn't, but we had like 3 months to figure it out. And then it's one of those situations where it was a challenge and you want to be faced with things that you want the puzzles to figure out. Because when you solve them, it's the most gratifying, like that's what makes it all worth it. And Annie had said a while ago in like another talk, I think specifically for you guys, was just talking about like creative directors are just problem solvers. And the people that are really good at it, do it fast and solve the problem on their first try. Like that's all it really is. And so the more problems you get faced with, the more like gratifying and rewarding the projects are and the job is. And one of the best things about the Infatuation has always just been like, never really get faced with no's or stops or don't do that. It's really only ever, any idea is ever met with, what do you need from us? Or how can we help you do that? And so those are the spaces you want to work in as a creative and a brand builder. Being put into really tight boxes with really tight guidelines and really strict rules is like just kind of picking up your lunch pail and going to work every day. And that's not why you do it. You want to work and be in opportunities that give you a space to be creative, be met with challenges, and then given the support to try to solve those in the most creative and effective ways. Yeah. And that's if you have opportunities like that, you don't pass them up. You stay and you keep doing it. Right?
It almost, I mean, in listening to the three of you talk, it almost sounds like the industry isn't as important as the role has been to the three of you. And, Nick, to your point about like solving problems is something that it seems like, really has you gravitating towards it and the types of problems that you have to solve in the roles that you're in. Is that, do you think you would have said that, in the first couple of years of your career, that like, these are definitely the problems I like to solve? And so, Rafat, I want to start a company and it doesn't matter what kind of company, or Nick, I want to be a creative director and it doesn't matter what kind of creative director, and Annie, it doesn't matter what field, but I'm a generalist and can solve all these kind of things. So this is the kind of role that works for me. How intentional was the pursuit to be the founder of a media company in travel, or a creative director, in travel specifically?
Well, plans never turn out to be what certainly life never turns out to be what we planned it to be. And certainly if we're planning at that young age, shame on us, or I don't know, something was wrong with us at that point. But I was, if you read my bio, my parents wanted me to be a computer engineer, because that's what back in the early days, the Indian parents.
The same type of parents, I'm aware.
Yes, so you know that very well. And I wanted to become an advertising copywriter. Had absolutely nothing to do with computers, and somehow ended up now in travel and media. When you start a company, you have a certain plan. Generally speaking, and I think I know this for Infatuation because I follow the brand, and I certainly know this for Lonely Planet because I've known the brand for a long time. The general broad strokes have remained, like what your impact on the world that they set out to have, they have achieved, or on the path to achieving. It's how you do it typically, unless you've totally pivoted the business itself, which obviously happens too. You generally, the strategies change on how to achieve it. but Lonely Planet wanted this Lonely Planet to be less Lonely Planet. They achieved that. Infatuation, definitely Andrew and team achieved that brilliantly. And by the way, JP Morgan acquisition was a stroke of genius on their part. I have no idea how it's working out, but when it happened, it was great. So I think from that perspective, the general thesis that we had, which is let's create a Bloomberg of travel, that was the 10,000-foot view, I would humbly say has happened. It's just obviously we're still a few ways away from the revenues of Bloomberg, but that may not happen. But we're well on our way for that.
What about you, Nick and Annie, about just the development and growth of your careers? Nick?
The answer to your question was like total opposite. Like when I first started, I was very focused on the things I wanted to work in. I really wanted to be in music. I wanted to work on sport. Like I cared very much about the stuff that was on my screen every day and the people I was working with, the topics. And now the complete opposite has happened, because you do it long enough, you start to realize the things that matter more are the freedom, the flexibility, the structure, how you work, who you're working with, the type of people you're surrounded by. It's like, and it goes back to that thing I was saying before, is like, I want to work in a medium I've never have before. I want to try to do things that I haven't done at all before. And it's not so much about the subject or the point as it is how you work, not what you're working on. And I think that is the big thing I had to learn over time, a lot more about time management, prioritization, the things that matter to you. You only really understand that as you do it for a while. But yeah, early on, I was just like, I'm working in music and I'm only working in music because that's what mattered to me. And then you do it long enough and you start to realize like, that's not what actually matters. It's the projects and how they are being facilitated, executed, and then published ultimately, right?
Yeah. Annie, anything to add there?
Yeah, no, totally. I think Nick nailed it. It's kind of like what you're spending your time doing and how it feels for me, not to get like too hooey, but I'm kind of like, I love writing. I love, being on set, all of those things. I didn't know that this was a job, certainly not in travel, which is like such a privilege and an incredible opportunity. So I just gotta ride it till the wheels fall off. Really, I don't think that's a very good like advice for somebody in their career. But the fact that you can like build an avenue based on what you're good at and what feels good and what feels right, and like working with people and uplifting them and kind of collaborating along the way is the dream. But yeah, I think it was just like, I'm good at writing. I like the task of problem solving in these very specific ways, and applying it to a brand that I've always loved, like Lonely Planet, just like feels like a perfect fit. But if not here, I hope to continue doing those aspects and other aspects of my job that feel right, forever.
Yeah. Love that. There's a number of questions that have come up in the chat. So I'll just ask one more and then maybe we'll flip to some questions from the audience. Last question I have is just to end on this note. There's a ton of folks in the audience that are coming from different brands in the travel and food space. We've tried over the last week to just aggregate a bunch of them together across our community, existing customers, new folks that we're starting to chat with. The three of you are building and have built fairly iconic businesses and brands in this space. Any piece of advice that you would give to another brand out there as they think about how to really make a mark specifically within this industry of travel and food? What's something that either you did in the past or you're looking about doing in the future that you think could really help, catalyze these brands forward? Maybe we'll start with Annie.
Yeah, I think get really specific on what you want to be known for, crystallize it, write it on the wall, write it on your forehead, write it on the back of your eyelids, and just like make sure everything ladders up to that, do that, have your thesis, and like always move towards that. You don't need to be doing absolutely everything. You don't need a meme account on TikTok if it doesn't make sense for your brand. Like really understand who you are and what you want to be known for, and then make yourself known for that against like every channel and avenue, and cut out all the rest. You don't have to be everything to everyone.
said. It's like I think a lot of the times, like we take cues from these monstrous brands that we all know that are global conglomerates, and we feel like brands need to be doing all of those things, and they need to feel like the Nikes and the Apples and whatever the world. And it's like, I think you should have a very, very clear sense of what your goal is, and a very, very specific goal. Like whether that's an exit strategy as a business, or to earn X amount of revenue, or to be featured in X, Y, and Z, or convert consumers to do like creative. I think one of the most important things that can be said in the world of branding and creative, or just brand building, is like a lot of the times, I'm not going to take credit for this, someone told me, but Alex Center at Center Design, but there's no good creative and bad creative. There's only effective and ineffective, right? So like you can't be effective if you don't know exactly what you're trying to accomplish. So I think the really most important thing is to have an understanding of what you're trying to do. And so often, like Annie had just said, like, well, we have to be on TikTok. And it's like, well, why do you have to be there? Like, what is the point? Are you trying to grow? You're trying to reach more people. You're trying to, and having an understanding of really specifically what your goal is. Any good brand building will help accomplish said specific goal. And if you don't have one, that's going to be, you're flailing trying to build a brand without real intention. So my thought process is to always be very, very specific about what you're trying to accomplish, and then work backwards from there into a strategy of how to do it.
I'll bring it a little bit to travel and examples in the travel industry, which is that for the longest time, a lot of travel brands, destinations particularly, but also resorts and hotels, have shown types of people they want to come, typically Western, white, et cetera, et cetera. Versus now the realization that you probably should ask, for instance, Puerto Rico, the reason I gave the example is that they latched on to, particularly after the Hurricane Maria, on let us, I think you said this, Annie, which is highlight the local voices, let Puerto Ricans speak. And that is the campaign. Fiji, the same thing. Fiji, in fact, came out with a campaign 2 years ago, very much a Western sort of, here's who we want. Fiji's opening up, please come, which we criticized quite a bit. Actually, we did a story that unfortunately was massacred them very badly about this campaign. A little harsh. They've come out with a new campaign that they've completely changed their logo and their branding completely to be very much about the native communities of Fiji, and them speaking and them talking about why they like living in Fiji and what the Fijian spirit is. So the long answer to your question is ask your local stakeholders what you should talk about, versus first going to an agency and let the agency come up with the creatives, et cetera, et cetera. Because typically these brands in travel exist within a community, and they're your best advocates if you do this right. So I think that's kind of the thing that we have seen as a theme in the travel industry particularly.
It's a great one. There's a question from the audience here, that is, I'm being challenged to constantly create more content in more places at a higher level of quality. Do you have any tips for how to produce effective creative, as Nick has put it, and how to manage that at scale in multiple destinations? Any tools or services that you folks use, or processes that you have in place, it sounds like?
ChatGPT. I'm kidding. But also real. But also
let the computers do it. Yeah.
It's all about, it's our future. AI is, look, it's such a hot topic right now. You're probably using the software, right? You guys,
yeah,
you're probably thinking about incorporating different parts of it.
Every investor, if I just changed our deck and inserted AI instead of air and cut out the R, I think we'd be raising. But have any of you integrated AI into some of your work in any meaningful, measurable way?
Yeah.
Specifically.
Yeah, we have. Not so much content creation, but certainly image creation. Mid-Journey, we started using because in travel, the images become very generic after a while, like a beach is a beach is a beach type photo. So trying to come up with new ways of, we did a story on baggage tech and the state of airline baggage tech. And we could certainly have a photo of a baggage carousel in an airport, boring, and versus actually creating. So we created that and used it. We're using AI for, we have a daily podcast, just like a 3 to 5 minute podcast, just headlines. And the company that used to do it, third party, that went out of business. And so we write the script, we used to send it to them. We're now experimenting with using the voice, because you can feed a text to an AI and it will narrate in human voice. That's beginning to become very, very good at human narration. And so we're beginning to experiment with using that, not for our regular podcast, which is more of a Q&A format like we're doing here, but for a quick 3 to 5 minute stuff. So we're beginning to experiment. And if you're in the creative field, how can you not? I mean, this is the most creative time, even if you're threatened by it, to use the tools to scale yourself, to experiment, to come up with new ways of thinking. I know I'm talking generic in terms, but that's really how you have to be an optimist in this age of AI, because there's no other way to exist.
Nick and Annie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, well, I have a stronger answer, I think, for the original question than the AI stuff, because more will be revealed, and like we're open to slotting that in where it will help our users and where it will help like their travel experiences. But right now, we're still human powered. And to that, like the original poster asking the question, like, I feel you, we are a lonely planet. There is a spread there. We have every place on planet Earth. So the way that I have wrapped my head around how to boil the ocean and create content for every place, every platform, is what we call create once, publish everywhere, trying to insert at the commissioning level with our contributors of, okay, who's great at writing, and can they, while they're on location, get some social content for us. And then the counterpart to that is having a really strong example of what good looks like, so that you can spread it and share it. So I've been really keen on myself and my team really having strong control over pilots and the first to market example of all of these franchises and examples. And then once you have a really crystallized example of what good looks like, then you can spread it out and commission it and say, do this exactly. Here is the shot list. Here's how you arrive at it. And you get those reps in once you have arrived at that example. But without that, it's really hard to commission and spread and scale before you've done it yourself once with success.
For sure. And the irony is like, we piggyback off of the how to scale it and went into AI. And I think the answer is kind of more like human beings. Like it's to me, we have to bring really great people into the organization on local levels that understand, like, just as Annie's saying, like, we're setting a brand standard. Here's how we do something. And we really set the stage for how it should look, how it should be executed, what our written guidelines are, what our brand guidelines are, how we execute video, how we do social content, what our voice is across all platforms. Like, we set standards around it, but then it's really dependent on the human beings carrying that out to the best of their ability. And then at a local level, the thing we talk about all the time is that we want people to be able to talk to locals as a local. And this is a really bad example, but like the best one that's coming to my mind right now is like in San Francisco, people don't say San Fran, right? Like they say SF or San Francisco, like that's it. And if you come in there and you start saying San Fran, people are going to look at you like you're crazy, right? So like it's really important but that's not something you can standardize and like message out across a global organization and scale. So it's understanding human behavior and having like a really clear sense of what matters to the people you're speaking to, but then at a high level, following a really strict perspective around like what, as Annie said, what is good? Like how is something effective? How do we make something effective? And then taking it and putting it in the hands of people that can do it at a local level is really the best way to scale stuff. But again, it really starts with bringing in great humans to be able to carry out the brand on your behalf.
Yep. Last question from the audience here, and then we'll look to wrap, is from Robin Block. Everyone travels, especially those with more disposable income. What are your thoughts about brand building and creative for other than millennials and Gen Z? How far have you pushed your creative within groups outside of that? I'm assuming that means an older audience.
One of the things that has certainly happened, and if you remember this, and now it seems so far away, when COVID first, when the vaccine first came, and the first people to get the vaccine was the older generation, because the age restriction. They were the first ones to start traveling after that. And there was stories we were doing at that point that 21 is that 21 travel cohort looks a lot older than what it used to be 2019 and stuff. Obviously now it's changed. The most amount of time and the most amount of money is still with the older generation. We can kid ourselves about Gen Z and millennials all the time, but Gen Zs are still living with their parents. Some of the millennials are still living with their parents. The money is with the parents. And so that's who is spending. So I think the smart brands are sophisticated. You look at hotel companies and their portfolio approach. Certain brands are to different, not just generations, but also interests, different personas. The same, I'm making it up, but a Hilton in one persona will have a certain type of brand for me. In another persona will have a different type of brand for me. And so certainly that's the case in a lot of travel brands, which is they're building a portfolio approach to having different types of experiences, to have different types of things for different cohorts, age cohorts, interest cohorts. One of the big things that we're following, and we can call it the post-experience economy, whatever you want to call it, passion economy, is brands built around different passions. There's a Japanese hotel company called Hoshino Resorts, which launched a cycling-focused hotel in next to a very famous cycling track in Japan. Very interesting. So those are the types of, there are a bunch of, there's a surfing-focused tour companies that are taking these extreme surfers to extreme locations. Another example of passion-based. And so passion-based communities are sort of how people are moving beyond just generational things.
Yeah, for me, I think luckily the Lonely Planet has that, because we've grown for the past 50 years. So we have a bunch of older enthusiasts. My alarm's going up. Older enthusiasts and fans, but I think it's a brand voice to us, because it's about like how you talk about a place. Everybody wants to go to, let's say, Belize, but you don't have to be like, slay Belize, like see you there, like it's just talking about a place in a way that makes sense to most people, in a way that people talk. And the Infatuation has been really inspirational to me in that, of like, what do you search? Like places where you take your parents out to dinner. That's how people search. That's how people talk. Places I can sit alone at the bar and have a drink without feeling weird. That's what people search. That's how people talk. I think a lot of that is ageless and evergreen. And so you just don't you want to talk in a specific enough voice that you feel like a crystallized brand, but not in a way that ostracizes people. And yes, Meg, I see. Also do Slay Belize.
We're gonna have to make Slay Belize t-shirts, I think, after this webinar. So it's coming up. Nick, anything to add?
No, I mean, it's Annie just touched on it, is like in the end, where while you want to have a target demographic or like a group of people that you feel like you can consider to be your consumer, really in the end, what the Infatuation tries to do is solve people's restaurant problems and like figure out where to go for what situation, and really isn't defined by an age or a demographic. And like a really good example is restaurants that are super close to the subway stops when it's too cold to walk, right? Like that is ageless. Like that has no bearing on, income or religion, creed, age, any of it, right? It's like all people get cold and don't want to walk that far when it's cold outside. So we try to take a perspective of like utility first, entertainment second, and our best stuff sort of lands in the middle. And then ultimately too, like we try to be very open around the perspective of, again, like use case for all people. So when you look at the list of the best restaurants in a city, yeah, Le Bernardin is on there and is a high-end, expensive, fancy white tablecloth experience, but also like L&B Spumoni in like Brooklyn to stand outside and eat a slice of pizza is on the same list. So it's not, we try to be, we try to give accolades to restaurants that are trying to be very excellent at what they are trying to do. And that ultimately democratizes the ability to absorb the content. It's for all people, anywhere, anytime. So to answer the question is like, you may market to a specific group of people with the piece of marketing you're doing or the piece of branding you're trying to execute. But as a brand mission and an overall perspective of brand, the more encompassing and inclusive your brand voice is, as Annie had said, or how you speak, the better, because really you don't want to isolate any one group. You should be thinking about all people at all times.
Well, a huge thank you. I think it's a great note to wrap up on. A huge thank you to Annie, Nick, and Rafat for donating your time graciously. We sincerely appreciate it over at AIR. I'm sure a bunch of the folks here today did. For those in the audience, if you'd like to find out any more about AIR, it's air.inc. And we'll just end in short with the Nick, Annie, and Rafat. We'll try to send you something as a thank you, but in a dream world, if I could send you on a trip to a place, what is the #1 place the three of you would like to visit, just to close, just for the future, in a hypothetical world where Rafat, I introduced ChatGPT into AIR and we raise hundreds of millions of dollars and I can buy you flights? Where am I flying each of you to?
Tajikistan.
Tajikistan. Okay. Nick, Annie, similar or different? Belize for Annie is my assumption.
No, I think the Maldives. I just am ready for some R&R, some classic R&R, or Algeria is on my list.
Got it. Nick?
I haven't been able to go to Asia yet, so Japan, Tokyo specifically, I would love to experience.
Done. I wrote all those down. They're on the list. I'll be sending flights here in 2030, hopefully. But thank you all for joining. Sincerely appreciated it. Really appreciated the time and perspective.
And please buy Shane software.
Use AIR. It's amazing.